So I got all that weighing on me as well at the moment, but for funeral type things. Okay. Oh God, I think I have some tests to get back. If I can find in this pit of stuff that I'm carrying around with me. Some of you wanted your tests back. Shame on you. You really want to know what you got. Let's see if I brought it. I know I had it in the car. See if I transferred it to this bag. Please, please, please. Say that you did. I think so. Let's see what I got here. Aldiusha Veficepho. I think I got another sheet somewhere in here. Good exam. See, you're not probably as dumb as you think. Saman Qureshi. That's you? That's a good exam. Monique Turner. Well, that's Old Testament. No, what's this? Oh, that's different stuff. Morgan Edmonds. Nadia Patel. Monica Ortiz. Well, no wonder if some of you guys are having some difficulty here if you don't ever appear. Here's one, Monica Ortiz, that goes with this. Okay. That's that. I should have some, roll sheet somewhere, if I'm lucky, given the poor state I'm in here. And yet I don't see my roll sheets. So who's got a piece of paper? We'll pass on a piece of paper, okay? Because I don't see the printouts that I have for the roll sheets in any of these things that I'm supposed to be carrying around here. Anyone got a piece of paper they can rip out and put the date on it? All right, put the date on it, room 3331, the date, and we're ready to go. Questions? So we were talking about the fact that at one time in the Islamic world, there were three caliphates operating side by side. Today they're trying to freeze us out of this room. Sometimes they're trying to sweat us in, other times they're trying to freeze us out. What were they? So, from a huge Umayyad Caliphate in the 700s, expanded as far as India and Morocco, to an Abbasid Caliphate in the 750s, 800s, till about 850. Still by 750 and 800, the Abbasid Caliphate was starting to be cut down to size. And as you know, what was the first disconnect from the Abbasid Caliphate that occurred? The situation in Spain was changed. Who came into Spain and was proclaimed by the Arab tribal contingents in different towns in Spain? What was his name? You know. Your friend knows. She's not here. What's her name? What's her last name?
Patel.
What?
Patel.
She's Patel. She didn't get her test ever.
So Muawiyah?
Well, no, that's Muawiyah. No, that's of a previous time. His name was... Hey, I'm old. I've got Alzheimer's. I'm not supposed to remember this. You're young. You're supposed to remember these things. Abdurrahman the First. Abd, by the way, means what in Arabic? No, that's Ibn. You're guessing. Abd, slave, servant, slave up, slave up. In Hebrew, Ebed Yahweh, slave of Yahweh. In Arabic, Abd al-Rahman, Rahman the Merciful. Slave, servant of the Merciful. But anyway, his name was Abd al-Rahman the First, called the First because I'm sure he wasn't called the first at that time, but as seconds, thirds appeared, he became the first. And as these early caliphs in these dynasties tend to be, he was extremely powerful and very successful. And he had a pretty long reign, usually 30 or 40 years when they survived. And his was like that. And the story of his escape that we told you last time was a very romantic story. His freedman Badr rescuing him from the Abbasid police. When they were on the other side of the Euphrates, watching his younger brother killed by the police, smuggled across North Africa because his mother was a Berber, through Berber tribes, and then appearing in Spain around 754 or 5, right after the Abbasid Caliphate was proclaimed in the east, and the tribesmen being disaffected by the Abbasid Caliphate appearance and preferring their loyalty to the Umayyads, accepting him and proclaiming him caliph. So Spain they lost Spain almost immediately, the Abbasids. What was the difference in the Umayyad claim and the Abbasid claim again? The Umayyad claim was more of an Arab, you didn't drop, huh? You're going to stay, are you?
Yes.
Oh, good. Do that, Sam, you'll be okay. The Umayyad, just keep reminding me what I need to give you for a take home and stuff like that. Okay. The Umayyad claim was more of an Arab tribal claim, very poor Islamic claim according to the strict Muslims. It would be like Al-Qaeda today looking at some of these regimes like Mubarak or something, you know, considering them, or even Saddam Hussein, who was more Arab nationalist, considering them corrupt, not religious enough, and so on. What was the Abbasid claim? The family of the Prophet. The family of the Prophet. Who was Abbas? The uncle of the Prophet. Good Muslim? No, not particularly, not noteworthy, never heard of in the early situations, except retrospectively. Wasn't one of the chief players, but because of that, you could make propaganda for him in a way you could not for others. He had no enemies. He had no enemies. No one knew him particularly. He wasn't a significant figure, but his only significance was that he was the family of the Prophet. So therefore, under that banner, you could politically cobble together quite a good alliance, which is what they did. And but it became more like an Eastern empire, more like a Persian dynasty. It really was a successor to the old Persian dynasties, which is why the capital was moved away from Damascus, further west to Iraq, the old Persian capital in Ctesiphon, as I told you, which was now in ruins, the capital of what was called the Sassanid dynasty of Persians, to Baghdad, a small village that was beautified and turned into a mighty capital, often with a lot of stones from the old Persian capital of Ctesiphon. So, the Abbasids, therefore, were more of an Islamic caliphate. And they took the mantle as a successor to the Prophet quite seriously. They weren't just Arab chieftains, Arab kings. In other words, they felt, since they actually had been brought in by minority support, the banner was first raised. By the way, what color is the Abbasid banner? Do you know? Black. What color is the Ali banner? Green. You look at a person's colors, some of those headdresses people wear around often from the Middle East, if it's green, you know that there's Alid sympathy there. If it's black, Abbasid sympathy. Things like that are very significant color-wise. Black for the Abbasids, green for the Alids. And you see on the Arab flag to this day, often there's a lot of stripes of different black or green. And that's what it represents, those colors. In any event, see, this is a very romantic history, very exciting, and now you see why these more modern people look back to this age as a kind of golden age to be restored. You know, the time when Islam was in the ascendancy, was flourishing, and so you see why you have people who hark back, want the new caliphate as they start talking about unify all the Muslim countries and so on. Stone-throwing youths in Paris suburbs, burning cars and things like that, not happy with Western life. The problem there is that there's going to be a huge reaction against them, and what they want to achieve is just not going to be achieved, and in fact it's going to hurt them and their communities more than it's going to move towards helping what they want to, what they think they want to do, and that's the problem of allowing young toughs, you know, within the community, freedom to behave lawlessly and violently and in that manner, somewhat, from what one hears, encouraged by gangster rap French style. What happens is that the community itself, as we found out here in America in the 70s, suffers. It's Watts that gets burned down. It's their own businesses that get burned out. And the community doesn't really recover very easily from it. What the wise thing, what should be done, the wise thing is that elders, people who have legitimate grievances, should have to control those elements, lest they bring disaster down upon everyone, and work together with the general authorities in a nonviolent Martin Luther King type way to move the situation forward in an intelligent, serious way. What happens in this kind of situation is actually you're going to get a right-wing government in France that's going to get very repressive, and a lot of people are going to be thrown out of France. So, I mean, what they want to achieve is just the opposite of what's going to be achieved. Anyway, I won't speak to that any further, but this harking back to the Caliphate is a dream. It maybe has substance. But you see, as soon as the Caliphate, the Abbasid one, which is the main one that they hark back to, they don't hark back to the Umayyad Caliphate. It's the Abbasid Caliphate, 500 years, 750 to 1250s. But how strong really was the Abbasid Caliphate? I told you last time. As soon as it was established, it was started to decompose. The Spanish part fell away within 5 years of its proclamation. The Aghlabids in Morocco were around 800. And in the 900s, the Fatimids, who were a Shiite caliphate, I'll talk to you about that in a moment, were already active in Tunis in the 930s, and that was disconnected. When they marched on Egypt in the 960s, Egypt was disconnected. It became even Shiite. So where was the Abbasid Caliphate? Within 100 years or 200 years of its founding, it had already just been reduced almost just to what we today call Iraq. And the pressure was not just from the West. The pressure was also from the East. In Iran, Persia, constant Iran-Persian nationalist uprisings were occurring almost as soon as the Abbasid Caliphate was formed. And these uprisings were all Shiite. For some reason, Shiism suited the temperament of the Persians even down to the present day. And these uprisings were all Persian. And one particularly successful group was around the 950s, further east than Baghdad, called the Buyids. And they actually, as I told you, were able to come in and take over the Abbasid Caliphate. But they didn't kill the caliph. They reduced him somewhat to a figurehead. They thought that the idea of the caliphate was a positive thing in terms of the impression it made on people. So they, like people sustain the monarchy in England or the papacy in Rome, they kept the figurehead, the idea of the caliphate going, but they were the actual temporal rulers. And they styled themselves things like amirs of the faithful. Amir in Arabic means commander. Amirs of the faithful. Think of it as Amir al-Mu'minin or something to that effect. Amirs of the faithful. And they also took names like Saif, meaning sword. Saifuddin, sword of religion. They were the government. The caliph, he was like the pope, if you want to call it that. He was the successor. He had no temporal power to speak of. He was more like a figurehead. So by the 950s, the Abbasid Caliphate in the 960s had been reduced both in Egypt and even in Iraq to only a figurehead status. So this mythological caliphate that they all want to hark back to is fine. However, they're not very realistic in terms of what the history actually was. They have dreams. They have, visions of grandeur, splendor, which reality often gainsays. Not totally, but often does. So that in the 1000s, new forces were coming from the east. Who originally came from the east? The Persians, all coming into Baghdad, sweeping into Baghdad, taking over. Well, who was pushing the Persians? Well, the Turks were pushing the Persians to go east. Who was pushing the Turks? The Mongols. You have a kind of constant succession of groups pushing one another westward from the east, out of the steppes of Central Asia. I don't know why you had these population explosions there, but you did, and they were very warlike often. They had not lost the ability to survive in a natural state, in a horse-driven society, in a rough and ready kind of military manner. So the Turks in the 1000s were pushing the Persians. And by the end of the 1000s, around 1070 or so, the Turks had taken over Baghdad. But they too kept the caliphate going. This group of Turks that pushed westward at this time were called the Seljuk Turks. They're not the later Turks who were called what? The ones that we hear about in the empire that's so famous. I keep hitching up this belt, and I apologize. For you people who've seen me with my belt falling down, it's because this is this weird Italian belt that the more you hitch it up, the more it stretches. So by the end of the day, it's already loose. I bought it from this company in Australia, and I'm really angry at it. That's why I brought the bag to show my students where it came from. But I can't say, why do you wear it? I like it. I like it. It's a nice belt. I paid $100 for it. I'm going to keep it, you know. It's a souvenir of my trip to Aussie land. In any event, yes, I feel close to it, even though I think I was taken to the cleaners. All right. So who was the other Turks who we know that you saw at the museum and things of that Turkish group in Istanbul? What do they call those Turks? You remember? Ottoman Turks. Those are the Ottoman Turks. That's from the Ottoman Empire. That's a later Turkish group from the 1400 period that follows the Seljuks in. But you see the Turks are coming in now. These are new converts to Islam, funnily enough. They were pretty wild, but at least where the Persians and the Turks go, there was conversions. Now the Shiites, the Persians had been, you know, for somehow reason felt very comfortable with Shiite Islam. And Shiism to some extent expressed their national identity and their nationalism. And so it's the same today, isn't it? Persians are nothing if not Shiites. It's just part of their national identity. And the Arabs, some Arabs are Shiites in the Iraq area, but the Arabs are not very comfortable or feel very sympathetic towards this Persian sort of activity. There's Persian influence in Lebanon because of the Shiites there. There's Persian influence in Qatar, I think it's Qatar or Bahrain, those places where there's Shiites in the eastern part of the Arabian Peninsula. And of course in southern Iraq, the Shiites outnumber the Sunnis, actually. How this occurred, you'd have to really look into the history carefully, but it's where the Persians who had control in the old days. Shiism somehow was very accommodating with Persian national cultural thing. Well, the Turks, unfortunately for the Persians, Turks and the Persians don't get on. Arabs and Turks don't get on. Turks and Arabs, nobody ever gets. You say you have to be taught to love. Who do people hate? Well, usually they hate their neighbors. Why do they? Because they know their neighbors. Usually, it's hard to hate people you don't know. Although some people even do that. But usually, even in your neighborhood, when you're in your home in a residence street, you don't hate the person on the next street. You don't even know who they are. But the guy next to you puts his garbage pails out in front of your house, runs over your weeds, he hoses down his thing and sprays it on your car, makes too much noise at night. You get to dislike that person, at least in your mind, because you know that person. This is unfortunately what happens. If you look all over the world, you'll find that the most hatred in the world is directed against neighbors. I mean, Germans don't like French. French don't like Germans. English don't like Germans. English don't like French. Americans and Canadians have an issue. Mexicans and Americans have an issue. And so on and so on. Japanese and Chinese. Japanese and Koreans. It goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on. Everywhere where there are neighbors, there's dislike. You say, why isn't there love? Well, that's not the natural state of mankind, obviously. There's negative feelings developed. So the Persians, and the Arabs never really did see eye to eye and still don't. And that's a lot of what's happening in the Iraq situation at the present time. In any event, the Turks come in. They're another group now that don't see eye to eye with the Persians. When I was young like you and I went across Turkey on trains and hitchhiking and places like that, and I was keeping company sometimes with Persians that were going across Turkey too to go home, I remember standing at the window with a Persian guy. He was very sophisticated. He was studying, I think, in Germany or someplace, and he was looking out the window at the Turks and the railroad stations and saying, donkey people, donkey people. These are all donkey people. And he was a nice fellow, the Persian guy, but he was just expressing the Persian attitude towards the Turks, donkey people. I mean, it's not plus or minus, it's not a nice thing to say, but you feel the animosity there that person felt. And you would never be able to convince that person to be comfortable or feel friendly towards Turks. And I'm sure vice versa. Turks feeling friendly. Look at how the Turks treat the Kurds. Very negatively. And so on and so on and so on and so on. And the Turks and the Armenians. And the Turks and the Greeks. And so on and so on. Well, when the Turks came in, they had been converted out in Central Asia by missionaries from the Abbasid area. And Islam made inroads out there. And of course, the Russians are still dealing with all the inroads out there. And they came in as Sunnis. The Turks became big champions of Sunnism. So the missionaries out in the Turkish area were Sunni. And the results are still being dealt with today, aren't they? The Russians are dealing with this issue in the breakdown of their imperial sort of hegemony out there. There are all these republics no one ever heard of. Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, I don't even know half the names of those places out there. And they're all Muslim. And almost all of them, there should be some Sunnis here and there, but most of them are almost all Sunni. And this is the result of Abbasid propaganda and proselytizing in this period from the 750, 800, 900s. And in the 1000s they came in. Well, so the Turks were styling themselves as sultans, amirs and sultans,
Not, they never took the name Caliph. Caliph was reserved for an actual successor to the Prophet. They started, and even when the Turks had a huge empire, the Ottoman Empire, they never called themselves caliphates, did they? They never called themselves caliphs. They only styled themselves as sultan. How many are familiar with that term? Heard it? Yeah, the Sultan of Turkey. What does sultan mean in Arabic? Power. Ruleship. Just like Saif, sword, Amir, commander. Sultan, power, force, government, rule. So that's how they styled themselves. But they were, again, protecting the caliphate. But the Turks, the different tribes that were on the move in a nomadic sort of way with wagons and things like that, and then slowly, these Turkish tribes were penetrating not only northern Iraq, where were they mainly going into? Well, the Byzantines had never been totally conquered by the Arab and Muslim armies from the Ottomans or the Abbasids. And they managed to hold their own in what we call, I don't know what you call it, Asia Minor. Have you ever heard of that? You've seen it on the maps? The Turks call it what? Anatolia. You've heard of that word? Anatolia. So those areas there were still under Byzantine control. The Muslims had not penetrated. Today, what are they? They're totally Islamic. But then they were Greek, Hellenistic, Byzantine, Greek Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, and so on. The border was at the Syrian mountains. And they never really managed to change that. Well, I think it was on purpose that probably the authorities encouraged the Turkish tribes coming north to penetrate those areas and slowly push into those areas as settlers and whatever. Just like the Roman authorities encouraged the Goths, the Visigoths and others to... That's you.
Sorry.
Sorry. You want to turn it off at that moment?
That's all right.
Yeah, please do. Just like the others, never really, the Romans encouraged all these barbarian tribes, as they called them, Germanic and Finnish and Hungarian type groups, to go into Spain and North Africa, which is why Spain got to be called Andalusia, as I told you. Where did that name of Spain, Andalusia, come from? Who went into Spain under Roman encouragement before the Visigoths?
Bernadette?
Don't even try. That's just the point.
Vandals. Oh, they were there?
Okay, so the Vandals were pushed into Spain, or bribed to go off into Spain, and that's where the word, as I told you, Andalusia comes from, that word. The land from where the Vandals came, because the Vandals ultimately got to North Africa and the breadbasket of the Roman Empire in Tunis, where the Arab armies encountered them, as I told you. What?
I'm sorry.
You are interrupting me. I really would appreciate you just sit down and relax, because you come in the middle, and everyone we're in a flow of information. But go ahead. What's your story about?
No, I was just wondering what you said. The Vandals was pushed out of.
Pushed into.
They were pushed into Spain. But I've already told you that. This is just a review, and it's not even germane to what we're talking about. I'm just trying to compare you to what the Turks probably were being done by the Abbasid authorities, something like the Romans did to these tribes. So they finally went out and down into Spain and then into North Africa and so on. But the reason we call Spain Andalusia because of the Vandals. And also later the Visigoths went into Spain, as you know, bought off by the Romans. But first they had plundered and pillaged Rome before they were bought off and sent packing further, through bribes and promises of territory and stuff like that. I think the same thing probably happened in the Turkish push into Asia Minor. Because you see in this period, what was Asia Minor? Totally Greek, as I just told you. Greek Orthodox. Hellenistic. The kind of Asia Minor, if you know the New Testament, that Paul was walking around in. Paul was walking around in a Greek Asia Minor. In an Anatolia that was totally Greek. Well, the last gasp of that came when? After the First World War, when the Turks massacred all the inhabitants of the east coast of Turkey, the Greek inhabitants, Smyrna, which was a Greek city on the coast, near where you were, Al. It's called Izmir today. Your boat probably may have passed by there. Did it stop at Izmir?
No.
No, I stopped at Izmir. They have nice little carriages that you get off in and drive around. And it's very easy and peaceful and nice now. You don't realize the bloody history that is behind these places. But after the First World War, the Turks massacred everyone in Smyrna, a great Greek tragedy, and threw everybody out and so on. That was the last gasp of Greeks in Asia Minor, basically. And the Greeks haven't forgotten it to this day, and don't forgive the Turks anything, and so on. Well, so that's a 1,000-year story of that penetration and finally total takeover of Asia Minor by Turkish groups. The Turks are very powerful, warlike people. So they got into Baghdad in the late 1000s and basically took over the Caliphate, but it lived along under them for another 200 years. And it wasn't until the 1250s that the Caliphate was ended. Who ended the Caliphate? We said it last time. The Mongols. The Mongols were not like the Turks. Were not like the Buyids. Were not like the Shiites. The Mongols had not been Islamicized. The Mongols were really, I don't want to call them rapacious because I don't think they were rapacious. They were just, for some reason, out for plunder and spoil and conquest. What was driving them? Population explosion? I don't know. It started with Genghis Khan. And Genghis Khan was operating in the Central Asian, Mongolian area in the early 1200s. And he started his dynasty going, and then his descendants, Kublai Khan and others, went into China. They were grandsons of Genghis Khan, and they managed to take over large parts of China. And what were they called in China as emperors? They were, when Marco Polo goes to China, who does he meet? He meets a Mongol emperor of China. It's in the Marco Polo travel books. The armies, the contingents that come into the Middle East are led by another grandson of Genghis Khan, Hulagu. Hulagu. I like that name. It rolls off the tongue. Hulagu.
Sorry.
Just like you'd expect. And when they come through, it's scorched earth. They don't believe in, they're not interested in subject populations. They're not interested in anything but really plunder, and that's it. And everyone is killed and everything is burned. And that's what happened to the Mongol, so-called, you've heard of the Mongol horde, maybe? That's a different horde. This wasn't a horde. That came through in the Middle East. Another horde from other descendants of Genghis Khan went through Russia and the steppes of Central Asia and got all the way into Europe, into Hungary, where they were stopped. And the Magyars in Hungary are descendants of the Mongol so-called horde that swept through Russia. And there, those were tremendously devastating things that came all the way through the Russian steppes into central Russia. A lot of the Russian legends, I don't know, have you ever seen the Russian movie Alexander Nevsky? Anyone seen that movie, a Russian nationalist movie? Music by Prokofiev. In any event, they were made to picture the Russian resistance to the Mongols, and also the Russian resistance to the Teutonic Knights, both east and west, who were coming in both sides. So you get a lot of old Russian stories that tell the story of great Russian heroes who were supposed to be resisting, but really the horde swept over Russia and came into Europe and really was stopped somewhere in Hungary. Well, the Hulagu group took Baghdad and killed everyone, burned everything, and killed all the caliph's family. I mean, that was it. Exterminated the caliph. There's no caliphate after the Mongol, and that was 1257. So that's what happened, and that's the end of the Abbasid Caliphate. So when did it begin? 750 about? 740, 748, but by the time it took everything over, 750, 751. And then on into all the way 1257. Now we're going to move to a cultural part of this course momentarily for the rest of the term after I finish the history of things. And one of the reasons that we'll move over to culture, talking about the Abbasids, is that under the Abbasids, that's when Islamic culture really flourished. So even though there were these political situations going on and other things of that kind, culture was really encouraged in the 800s, particularly the height of the Abbasid Caliphate. And in the 900s, it started to fall off in the 1000s. But the golden age of Islamic culture, or Arabic, really Islamic culture, is in the 800s and 900s, on into the early 1000s, and then things begin to fall apart and deteriorate to some extent. But that's the golden age, if you want. And the Abbasids encouraged this, encouraged cultural things. And for instance, at one time in the city of Baghdad, the story goes that there were 3 translation houses working night and day to translate all of Greek literature into Arabic. All Greek philosophical texts, all Greek scientific texts, all Greek medical treatises, everything was translated into Arabic in Baghdad. And that influenced a lot of Arabic culture, from mathematics to astronomy. The Arabs had translated Euclid. They knew all the dialogues of Plato. They knew all of Aristotle. All this was put into Arabic and created an Arab philosophy, philosophers that succeeded Aristotle and these people. We'll talk about them when we talk about the culture that we're going to talk about presently. But everything was started really in the 800s in Baghdad, in this area of culture. So that's why and one of the things we're going to start with in the culture are the pre-Islamic Bedouin poets. You say, well, why do we do the pre-Islamic Bedouin poets in the Bedouin period? Because the collections of poetry were done in Baghdad under the Abbasids in the 800s. That's when the collections were done in order to teach new people coming into Islam and Arab culture, what the classical Arab Bedouin culture was, and to also give them the Arabic of the desert, because the Arabic of the desert was considered to be the pure, perfect Arabic. But the editors of these collections were mostly Persians. It was mostly Persian intellectuals who had come into Islam, who were collecting the Arab poems, basically to get control of the Arab language so they could learn it, learn the perfect Arabic. And that's what the Abbasid Caliphate was like. The Abbasid Caliphate was a kind of pan-Islamic caliphate. It was a many-people caliphate. It wasn't a Arab national caliphate per se. And at one point, the Abbasid caliphs even tried to assimilate the Shiite line. And after the first generation of Abbasid caliphs, the ones I said was, one was called Jafar, the first one, and the other was called Al-Mansur, and that would be the late 700s. Al-Mansur means victorious. And his son was Harun. Harun al-Rashid. Harun al-Rashid, you may have heard of him. He's the famous Islamic Arab caliphate in all song and story. The 1001 Nights, the Arabian Nights, are written about Harun. Harun is the son of Al-Mansur. And that's where the flowering takes place, around 800. Harun sends representatives to Charlemagne, and Charlemagne sends representatives to Harun, and they're in touch with each other. Harun's capital is Baghdad, and it's fabled in its glory and beauty. And that's all in the famous 1001 Nights, stories about Harun, and the fabled stories of his palaces, and all those incredibly, imaginative folk tales. Alibaba and the 40 Thieves and things like that. It's all from the 1001 Nights, but it all centers on Harun. You see Disney cartoons about this. That's about probably the level of its penetration in the general society. And you see these cartoons about, you know, the flying carpet, the palaces, the caliph. It's always Harun. Harun, by the way, means, comes from what word in Hebrew? Aaron. Aaron, the priest in the Old Testament, is Harun in Arabic. So his name is really Aaron, but in Arabic it's Harun. It's called Harun the Magnificent, Harun al-Rashid. Anyway, he has two sons. Al-Ma'amun, and I think the other one is Al-Amin. I think it's Al-Amin, I'm not sure, I think it is.
Yes.
He has two sons. Ma'amun, they squabble with each other for the caliphate, but Ma'amun ultimately wins out. But in any case, Ma'amun is another cultural figure, but he actually is engaged to one of the Shiite imams' descendants. Ma'amun wants to amalgamate Shiism and the Abbasids. And something bad goes down here. I don't know exactly. We'll do it when we do Shiism presently. I'm going to deal with Shiism momentarily. But something bad happens here, and this doesn't come off in some way, and it ends up badly for both sides. But Ma'amun is trying to amalgamate the Shiite partisans, the partisans of Ali, because it's the family of the Prophet after all, same type of thing, but more specifically focused on Ali and his immediate descendants, with the Abbasid family of the Prophet line, and to try to amalgamate the power of those two things. He fails. But if he had succeeded, Islamic history might have been quite a bit different. So that is, I think, the last attempt of that kind of thing, and we'll talk about that. That produces a division in Shiism. So in fact, in Shiism around the same time, and I think it's connected, but we don't have the actual records of it, so we can't say, we have 5 Imam Shiism. I'm going to tell you what these things are later. Five Imam Shiism, 7 Imam Shiism, and 12 Imam Shiism. And a lot of other offshoots. For instance, Baha'is, who follow the Baha'i Ummah, and Druze, who follow a teacher called Al-Darazi. And even in Syria today, the Alawis, who are now the present leaders in Syria. They're offshoots, or they're Shiite offshoots, those groups. You say, well, what's 5 Imam Shias? Well, I'll tell you about the Imam, not now, but later. But basically, it's the successors to Ali. Ali is the first Imam, and his 2 sons, Hassan and Hussein, are the second and third Imam. And where they consider the Imams to stop, that's where they become either they believe in a succession of 5 Imams, 7 Imams, or 11 or 12 Imams. Now, the 7 Imamers, who are known after the name of the Imam that disappears at this time, Ismail, are known as Ismailis after his name. The 7 Imam Shiites are Ismailis. So at the time of the 7th Imam, there was a break of some kind. There was one of the 5 Imams, was one of the 7 Imams. The 5 Imams, by the way, are known as Zaydis, after the Imam Zayd. And the 12th Imam, they're called Jafaris, after the Imam Jafar, who was actually Ismail's father. So there was a break somewhere in here. And that break between the Jafaris, though they go on to 12 Imams, has something to do with this Ma'amun situation, I think. It was around the time of this Caliph al-Ma'amun. It was something occurred here. I don't know what the whole thing was. But in any case, who are the 12 Imam Shiites today? They're the ones in Persia and Lebanon. They're all Jafaris. They're all 12 Imam Shiites. All the ones in Iraq are all 12 Imam Shiites. The Ismailis went further out. They're in East Africa. They're out in Afghanistan. They're out in India. They're in other places. Who's the leader of the 7 Imam Ismailis? Well, the Aga Khan, if you've ever heard of him. And even the name Khan, Aga Khan, means he's out originally from the steppes of Central Asia. He's Persian. But where does he hang out these days? In Sardinia. He developed the resort called the Costa Esmeralda. I was there this summer because I was taken to Italy by Italian television to appear on an Italian state television program on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and some people invited me out to Sardinia and the Costa Esmeralda, so I've seen this place. Pretty spectacular in terms of luxury and, if you like, rich watering holes for rich tourists and people like that. That's where the Aga Khan, he developed that. I think mainly he lives in Monte Carlo and places like that, Switzerland. In any event, his followers are mostly from East Africa. So I'll go back to that when I do the Shiites. But this problem of the Imam, the break in Shiism, occurred somewhere in here. But the Ismailis are not a force at the moment. Basically, when you talk about Shiism, you're talking about 12 Imam Shiism. The Jafaris from Persia. They're named after the 6th Imam, Jafar. 6th Imam would be the 6th successor to Ali, after he and Ali. So he would be the 3rd Imam after Ali's 2 sons. Anyway, we'll go back to that. But let's go forward and finish the history before we move over to the culture and the religion and the law and stuff, okay? So let's go back to our historical perspective, if you would allow me. So the Caliphate is wiped out in the 1250s by the Mongols. But before the Caliphate is wiped out, it was actually already weakened by what? Remember I told you the Turks came through in the 1000s? What happened between the 11 and 1200s? It's all on television these days. Because television has suddenly got, because of the Da Vinci Code, a huge bee in its bonnet about the Crusades. The Crusades, see, the Crusaders knew that there was problems in the Middle East at this time. And that they could maybe reconquer some of the lost territory because some of the difficulties the Abbasids were having. Who tipped them off to the fact that there were problems in the Middle East at this time? The Byzantines. The Byzantines had asked the help of the Latin Christians to reconquer territory that the Muslims had taken. That's really the bottom, what's at the root of the Crusades. And the Pope agreed to help. Before that, they'd been at odds, but at that point they started to try to cooperate. It didn't last long. And there was mainly focused on northern Syria, which had begun disconnecting itself also from Baghdad at this time. And the Byzantines wanted to make inroads into northern Syria. This would be around the time the Turks were coming in too, you see. So to some extent, when the Crusaders were fighting, they were fighting armies of Arabs led by Turkish chieftains. Now, the famous Arab commander in the Crusades, I just saw a thing on him in history television, was known as Salah ad-Din. As this is shortened by Christian and other, he's called Saladin, like he's a salad maker or something. He's Saladin, Salah ad-Din Saladin. Saladin is not an Arab. He's a Kurd, Turkish Kurdish people. The Turks call the Kurds mountain Turks even today. Whether they're Turks or not, I don't know. The Kurds don't like that. But he's a Kurdish leader from northern Syria. And so the leaders that they're facing of the Arab troops are Kurdish, are Turkish and Kurdish. They're not really Arab at all. The Arabs never were good at organized warfare. I mean, sustained, brutal, organized warfare. Raiding, yes, but sustained, brutal warfare, not really. Maybe that's going to change, I don't know, but I haven't seen much evidence that it's going to change. They're too mercurial in their temperament to some extent. And that's, I think, a plus, not a minus. They don't like that kind of nasty sort of brutal trench warfare of the First World War, that sort of thing. So the Crusaders start to come in the late 1000s. 1099 is when the Crusaders take Jerusalem. So not only is Syria falling away, Turks coming in, even the Palestinian Syrian areas are getting under Christian control. And the only reason they're reconquered is because of these Turkish Kurdish military commanders who were able to, organize the resistance in a more effective way than the Abbasids can. The Abbasids don't even control this area anymore. It's all little principalities. So really, the Abbasids are only in Baghdad and the area around Baghdad, in what we call Iraq today. What about in Egypt? The Fatimids. Well, the Fatimids started out by making propaganda, as I told you, in North Africa, in Tunis, in the early 900s. The person who made this propaganda was I forget what his name was, but he was a propagandist who was, the point of his propaganda was on behalf of a new line, not Abbas, not the Shia, although he was Shiite, but in support of the daughter of the Prophet and her descendants, who are Shia, who are Ali, of course, but make it even more specific, Fatimids. Fatima, not Our Lady of Fatima who goes down and cures people in southern France or someplace, some Christian saint. Fatima, the real Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet and the wife of Ali. In some regard, they consider themselves imams of some kind, but these are not 12 Imam Shiites of the kind you get in Persia or someplace. These were actually 7 Imam Shiites, Ismailis. Now, I don't understand how it happened, but their propagandist was successful, and Tunis in the early 900s became 7 Imam Shiite. And then their armies marched eastward because they saw that the Abbasid Empire was collapsing, and they took Egypt, which is a huge, of course, achievement and plum for them, because it was considered at that time, as to some extent it still is, a very, very rich place. And so the 12 Imam Shiites, or pardon me, the 7 Imam Shiites, the Fatimids, the Ismailis, all these are synonyms, Fatimids, Ismailis, 7 Imam Shiites, took over Cairo. But there was no Cairo. There was no Cairo at that time. There was Alexandria, there was southern Egypt, there was a small town called, it was a camp city of Omar's period, called Al-Fustat. They glorified that, magnified that into Al-Kahir to celebrate their great victories, which is now in the west called Cairo. Indeed, Mark Twain grew up there, didn't he? In Cairo, Illinois. That's how far Cairo goes. But the point of the matter is, Cairo is a Western, what would you call it? Bastardization of Al-Kahir. And what's Al-Kahir mean? I told you, triumphant. Triumphant. Who was triumphant? Whose triumph was being celebrated? I hope you Muslims in the room don't object to my telling you your history. In fact, you see, some of us Westerners probably know as well or better than you do. So it's good that someone can recite the history, whatever the background is. So you tell your colleagues, wherever they are, that hey, we have a class there, but even though the prophet, even though the professor is a unbeliever or something like that, he knows the history pretty well, and he can help us clarify these things. Don't forget to tell your co-religionists that if you ever talk about these classes, because some of us do know it fairly well. Actually, better than a lot of believers do. Not all believers, but a lot. So I mean, that's not such a bad thing. In any case, this Cairo then is a celebration of the Ismaili 7 Imam Shiite Fatimid victory over whatever was left of the Abbasid Caliph representatives there. So you get a new empire, as I told you, springing up in the 960s, 970s, and that goes on until the Crusades. And it's so, when are the Crusades? In the 1090s. Well, the Fatimids are not able to put up a good resistance a century and a half later to the Crusaders. That's why you have to have these other commanders come in from further afield in the 1100s. The First Crusade was very successful. It obliterated Jerusalem, if that's successful. The Crusaders massacred all the Muslims. Jerusalem was a bloodbath. They didn't even make any distinction between Jews and Muslims. They just killed everybody. They just went mad and killed everybody in Jerusalem. If you've ever been to Jerusalem, you can go into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and on one of the walls you'll see their little crosses that they've all carved on the wall. Each one carved a little cross. I have pictures of it to say that they were there. A little Crusader cross that they've carved on the walls of the church. If you do go in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, take a look at that wall. It's very moving to see that there, that graffiti is still there. In any case, Jerusalem slowly revived, obviously, but it became a Christian protectorate. But in the Second and Third Crusades, things went backwards. And the Second and Third Crusades were in the 1100s. Now, Richard the Lionhearted came in the, as we know, when was the Magna Carta? That's a good way to judge all that. 1215. And who was the king then? Richard's brother, John, because Richard was always away campaigning. You've seen the Robin Hood stories and everything? Richard was always out of the country. They were always having to buy him out of captivity here, there, or everywhere. He was either in the Middle East campaigning or he was in France. Why was he campaigning in France? Because he was from the house of Anjou, Aquitaine in southern France. His mother was Eleanor of Aquitaine. He was actually a Frenchman. He spoke French. That's why his nickname is Coeur de Lion. Coeur de Lion, Lionhearted. Richard Coeur de Lion. These are French kings in England. This is why the Arabs call all foreigners who come to conquest, for them, everybody is a Frangi. They're all Frangis. Why are they Frangis? Frenchies. Everybody to an Arab who is not from there, like in Japan you're a Gai Jing or something, or in Mexico, what do they call them? Yankees? What do they call them? What's the word? Gringos, right. Or other places in the Afro-American honkies or whatever. Well, in the Arab world, all Westerners are Frangis, which, because for them, all the knights were French. That's who they saw, French knights. And they didn't distinguish between an English knight and a French knight or anything else. They were all Frenchies, because they all spoke French. And they basically were all French, because who had conquered England anyway? In the late 1000s, William of Normandy. He was a Norman, a French-speaking Norseman, Normandy or Norseman, who settled on the Normandy coast and then conquered England in 1066. In any case, the point is that these knights were all French-speaking knights, and that's where the Arabs got the idea that all Westerners are Frenchies, Frangis. How many have heard in Arabic that term Frangi? You hear it on what's that television station that you get today, the modern Arab television stations from? Yeah, Jazeera. They're always speaking about the Frangis, the Frangis, the Frangis. We're Frangis. You guys are in my 302 class, like the Western Indians call all of the Western white sort of whatever mixture we are, Wasichus. Well, for the Islamic world, Frangis. All foreigners are Frangis. Frangis. Frenchies. Franks, French, Franks, Frenchies, Frangis. Well, so the Crusaders did weaken the Fatimid Caliphate with attacks. Richard went down there after he failed to take Jerusalem and messed around there in northern Egypt, and all these blows were just weakened and weakened and weakened the Fatimid Caliphate in England, in Egypt, until it collapsed under the blows, particularly of Saladin himself, who had made a name of conquering in Palestine, and then he basically was able to appear in Egypt. I don't even think there was a war, and there was no more Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt. Around the time of the Crusades, maybe 1200 we're talking about, 1210, something in there. See, the Crusader armies hit a huge reverse in the end of the 1100s against Saladin at the battle near the Sea of Galilee called the Horns of Hattin, where the whole Crusader army was wiped out and they lost control of Palestine, which is why the Third Crusade was proclaimed to try to regain control. And all the Third Crusade gained control of was the Palestinian coastline. Saladin and Richard made a deal: you keep the coast, don't bother Jerusalem and these other towns inland. And they had some towns in Syria, Edessa and places like that in northern Syria. All right, so Saladin took over Egypt and started a dynasty there called the Ayyubid dynasty in early 1200s. And that was the end of the Fatimid Caliphate. So that's the end of our three caliphates at the same time. Now there's only two. Had the Umayyads collapsed? Well, actually the Umayyads had more or less also collapsed in Spain. I'll tell you about that. That happened in the late 1000s also. So in fact, again, under the blows of the Crusaders, but also from North Africa, North African groups were swarming into Spain to try to resist the Crusaders in Spain, because the original Crusades were proclaimed in Spain to reconquer Spain. I'll get back to that. In any event, that had really collapsed around the late 1000s too. So the three caliphate scenario is really from around early 900s to late 1000s. But it finishes in 1200 with the collapse of the Fatimids, and then 1257 is definitely finished with the total annihilation of the Abbasids. Oh, I don't have much left. What's left to cover? Well, after the collapse of the Fatimids in Egypt, they were succeeded by Salah ad-Din's people for a couple of generations, not very long, called the Ayyubids. But this didn't seem to work well. And so what happened was, the Turkish armies were moving into Asia Minor at this point. Now it wasn't the Seljuk Turks as much as it was the Ottoman Turks. Another tribe of Turks that were making inroads in Asia Minor in the 1200s with the collapse of the Crusades. You know, the Fourth Crusade really paved the way for this, because the Fourth Crusade, the Venetian ships said, oh, why take them all the way to the Holy Land? Let's just drop them off of where we really want them to be anywhere, which was Constantinople. Let them go sack Constantinople. Why bother? There's no wealth in Jerusalem or Damascus, particularly that the Mongols have finished it off anyway. Let's drop them in Constantinople, which is what they did, and the Crusaders being like, according to the Arab literatures, we'll see total dumbos. I mean, the Arabs can have total contempt for the Crusaders, as intellectuals anyway, not as fighting men. We'll see some pictures of the Arab view of the Crusades in that collection of literature that I've got for you in that blue book that Al has there. You can start looking at that. There's one section, the Arab view of the Crusaders, and they look upon these people as total losers and complete intellectual, Neanderthals. But in any case, Venetians dropped them off in Constantinople, and so they sacked Constantinople. And take everything from Constantinople that they can get their hands on, and actually basically destroy the Byzantine Empire. So when the Ottoman tribes are still pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing in the Anatolia area, they finally, it takes them 2 more centuries to do the job. They don't take Constantinople again until 1453, but basically the Byzantine Empire is crippled from the early mid-1200s onwards. And that brings us to the Da Vinci Code. Because where did the Shroud of Turin come from? Well, when the Crusader Knights in the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople, they brought a lot of relics back to where they came from. Many of them were French knights. One of the relics they brought back was the Turin Shroud, because the Turin Shroud had been worshipped in one of these churches in Constantinople for 1,000 years. Now they say it's a forgery, but it's not, because we can trace its history back to about 300 AD. And they brought it to this church in France, who later, France is right near Turin, who later donated it to the parish of, or the diocese of Turin, some relations with the bishops or whatever there. In any case, that's one of the origins of the Shroud of Turin, the Crusader sack of Byzantium in the early 1200s. But to go back to Egypt, a new form of government started to flourish in Egypt called the Mamluks. I mentioned them last time. Now, that's an Arabic word, Mamluk. It comes from MLK, which is mulk, which means property, possession, money, substance, mulk. In Hebrew, it means kingship. Mulk, Malik in Hebrew and Arabic is king. Malik in Hebrew, Malik in Arabic. David, King David would be called Melech David. When you hear Jews sing about King David, they say, David, David, Melech Israel, King of Israel, Melech Israel. Malik in Arabic. In any event, mulk is another noun from that same cluster of consonants. And Mamluk means possessed by the government, possessed by the king, possessed by the authority. Mamluk is basically a slave or someone who's owned by the state. What they did was they imported conquered captives that the Turkish armies were capturing first in Turkey and northern Turkey, later in the Balkans. Later in the Balkans, as the Turks expanded their power up the Balkans towards Vienna, through Yugoslavia and these places. Albania, you know, is still Muslim. How did Albania get to be Muslim? Because the Turks pushed in on up in the 1500s. Bosnia is Muslim area of Yugoslavia with the pushing of the Turks up through the Balkans towards Vienna. They were stopped in Vienna around the 1600s. But in any event, all that aside, they would take levies and sell them to the Egyptian authorities. And these young boys, who were basically captives and slaves, white slaves now, were brought up in Egypt as rulers, owned by the state, slaves of the state. It was sort of like a Platonic republic. Someone had read Plato's Republic and had kind of said, this is the way to get a good ruling military class, get people who have no family loyalties. You know, how many have read Plato's Republic here? Well, in Plato's Republic, you have a philosopher king class, and then you have an auxiliary class, right? Let's get some people who don't have any family ties. Let's train them so they're not corruptible through family ties. It turns out they did get corrupted, but supposedly they were not to have families. The new successors were to be new levies of purchases of the Christian, mostly Christian children from the Balkans and other places. And they would be Islamicized, and they would become a property of the state, and they would fight for the state. And that worked. And the people who stopped the Mongols in Palestine was a Mamluk army. And this was already functioning, you see. For some reason, by 1250s, it was already functioning. I don't know how it got functioning so fast after. Maybe Salahuddin installed it, I don't know. But in 1259, at the Battle of Ain Jalut in Palestine, the Mongol expansion westwards was stopped in the Middle East. The Mamluk armies defeated the Mongols in Palestine at Ain Jalut in 1258 or 1259, I don't know the precise date there. But you see, that explains a lot of the situation in the modern Middle East, because it was scorched earth everywhere the Mongols had been previously. So Syria and Iraq were scorched earth. But Egypt survived untouched, and Palestine to a large extent. So the center of the Arab world, which had previously been in Baghdad, swung over to Cairo, though it wasn't Shiite anymore. Now it was Mamluk control. And the Mamluks flourished for about 300 years, into the 1500s. And they were a very successful dynasty, and they replenished themselves with new levies of slaves who were converted to Islam and then became governors and soldiers. And this situation actually moved into the Turkish world too. And the Turks had a whole group of slaves who were then part of the army, and they were Christians usually, but had been converted to Islam as boys, and they were called Janissaries. And the Turkish, if you know military history, the Turkish Janissary Corps was formidable and frightening. It was the backbone, like the French Foreign Legion of the Turkish army. The Janissaries, who were these somewhat like the Mamluks in Egypt, sort of like slaves or descendants of converted slaves or whatever. In any event, as the Turks got more and more successful, now the Ottoman Turks in Asia Minor, they did storm Constantinople, its famous date, 1453. And then they spread around the whole Mediterranean again, and they took Egypt in the early 1500s, around 1517. And they kept the Mamluks there as a kind of sub-control group, whereas they owed allegiance to the Ottoman Caliph, who now moved to Byzantium. And Al, you probably saw the Mosque of Hagia Sophia, which used to be the Cathedral of Santa Sophia. Beautiful, beautiful place. Now got minarets and everything around it. It is a handsome building, isn't it? It was the central church in Byzantium, but the Turks took it over and made it into a mosque. They put the center of Turkish Ottoman government in Constantinople. They changed the name of the city to Istanbul. Well, Constantinople, Istanbul is the same. Just a kind of bastardization again. Constantinople, Constantinople, Stanopol, Stanopol. Istanbul. That's how you get that word. It's just compression and a mispronunciation turning into an actual name. Yankee, I think, and hunky. I'll bet hunky comes from Yankee. And so to some extent it's from the English, I think. They couldn't pronounce Anglais, as the French said English. Anglais, 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 Yankees, 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 Hunkies, Hunkies. So that's where I think most people think the etymology of the word Yankee is from. Yankee imperialism, an English attempt to pronounce the French word for English. Now becomes standard vocabulary. We're in America are all Yanks. That's how language operates. Very interesting subject. Anyway, the Mamluks limped on in Egypt for another 300 years after that till the 1800s. 1800 exactly, when Napoleon appeared with a French Revolutionary Army and told the Egyptians, because he realized that the Ottoman Empire was weak, that he had come as a Muslim, because he was from Corsica and understood Muslim culture, and that he was a Muslim and he had come to free all Muslims, and that he was going to overthrow the Mamluk dynasty, which he did, and had a battle under the pyramids, the famous battle of the French troops. Unfortunately, at that time, the English fleet was fighting him, the same fleet that ultimately defeated him at the Battle of Trafalgar 7 years later, under Nelson. In 807 was the Battle of Trafalgar. Well, they also beat him at the Battle of the Nile. They sunk all his ships around 1800 when they were anchored at in the harbor off of the Nile and Alexandria. The British came in and destroyed all his ships and stranded Napoleon there, and he ultimately had to flee, lost his whole army there, went back to France and proclaimed himself emperor. But the fact of the matter, he was totally annihilated by the British in Egypt. But he did bring modernization to Egypt in destroying the Mamluk dynasty and creating a new country there and detaching it from the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire continued in control of everything. As I told you, Turks were Sunnis. They had the whole Middle East. They had most of North Africa. Egypt was Mamluk. They had control of the holy sites. They had Iraq. They had all these places that they'd conquered in the 1500s. And they stayed on until the First World War. And the First World War was fought somewhat in the Middle East. As you know, the Gallipoli campaign was fought by the British against the Turks off the coast of what's modern Troy at the mouth of the Bosphorus, where the British lost. But then they recouped, and they sent T.E. Lawrence of Arabia into Palestine. And they had columns coming in from Egypt they used as a base of operations. They'd already built the Suez Canal. And they ultimately destroyed the Turkish rule in the Arab provinces south of Turkey. The modern Turkey emanated from that, declared itself a modern country, we now call Turkey. And all the states we're dealing with now in the modern Middle East are what are called Ottoman successor states. They didn't exist prior to the First World War. That is Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Palestine, Israel. These are all Ottoman successor states, and we're still trying to work that problem out. Well, next time we'll switch to cultural subjects. So you start reading the pre-Islamic Bedouin Arab poetry in the collection that I gave you, okay? And we're going to switch to civilization subjects, although I think we won't do that right away. I'll probably do Islamic law and Islamic theology before I get to that, so you have some time. You didn't think I'd get to the end of this. Neither did I.